Hi, I'm Edwin Samuelson, and welcome to the Cinefiles, a show that allows you to eavesdrop on the conversation of fellow film fanatics. Today we'll be discussing horror anthologies, and I'm going to hand over the mic and the hosting duties tonight of this show to my left over here to Mr. Eric Cohen, who will introduce the rest of our panel. Go ahead.
You're going to hand over your mic. That means you're going to be silent for this one?
Go ahead, Eric.
Right. We wanted to do this show for Halloween, but we never had the opportunity to tape a Halloween show, and the closest opportunity we had to doing a Halloween show, I was out of town. You guys wound up doing something else. I have no idea what it was.
Hookers. Shows on Hookers.
Good.
We actually
wish I was here for that one. But yeah, we're going to do anthology horror film. It's a very special corner, a subgenre of a popular genre. And I guess the best choice...
Wait, what is it the subgenre of?
The subgenre of horror. The sub being anthology.
That was co-host Mike Foltz, by the way.
Jeff Galashaw.
Jeff Galashaw. I had to introduce them
I told
too.
you.
Dude,
Yeah,
he's burdening me with all this crap.
Okay, I'll do it.
He wants
Jeff
to give me
Galashaw, Michael Foltz, Eric Cohen.
It's very easy to tell us apart. You'll have to guess how.
So anyways, yeah, anthology horror films, you know, what we mean by, horror films with like little short stories with them to comprise one big film.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you for your sarcasm.
Anyway,
so I guess a good way to start off is with an Amicus film, because Amicus was sort of the production company that kind of made it popular. They were this British independent film production company that was set up to sort of compete against Hammer films.
Hammer Light.
but they were actually two Americans that actually went to England, and do you know what amicus means?
It
means friends in Latin.
It does.
Oh,
there you go.
I have nothing to
I'm a huge amicus.
Now, the biggest difference between Amicus and Hammer, Hammer was big on the period. Usually, they did the Dracula.
Very stylized.
Very stylized. They didn't start off as a horror film unit. They actually started off doing comedies and stuff like that, and then segued into sci-fi.
Because I think Hammer was originally trying to compete with Ealing Studios.
It's Ealing.
Ealing.
Even I know that.
Yeah, it's Ealing Studios.
Oh my God!
But then they hit pay dirt by remaking the Universal horror stuff like Dracula, Frankenstein, stuff like, but doing it unofficially. Anyways, Amicus decided to compete against these guys. Their biggest difference is most of their films were anthology films, so they did one or two standalone films, and most of them weren't period films. They were present day. So that's a big difference between Amicus and whatever. I think for me, my favorite horror film from the Amicus group was a film called Asylum. And it's an interesting film. It's written by Robert Bloch. It's not the first time he's written a film for Amicus, but I think this is one of his better written films. It's still kind of dated. It still has that 70s feel to it. The effects are kind of cheap, but I think it's got one of the more clever wraparound plot devices.
Definitely the best framing device.
Definitely the best framing device. I mean, the conceit of the film is a psychiatrist is brought to an asylum. He's being interviewed to possibly head up this new asylum. The catch is that the previous head went insane, and his test is to interview 4 different patients and try to guess which one was this former head. And so each patient's interview becomes this little, each person's story. I loved this film when I was a kid. Looking back on it, I still think it's a lot of fun. I still think it's the best of all the other anthology films that they put out. It doesn't feel as cheesy.
It's entertaining.
I almost agree with you.
It suffers from some of the cheesy effects. Like, for instance, the first story, if the effects were better, that could have been a chilling thing. But the effects were just kind of hokey.
I guess if we're talking about anthology films, we should say we try to give a little detail on what each story is about. You have the story with this
were an hour show, why not?
And it's very Tales from the Crypt-esque.
Yes,
basically.
but I found this one better than the original Tales from the Crypt movie, or at least I enjoyed it more.
That's my favorite of all the anthology films would be Tales from the Crypt, I would believe, for the amicus.
I liked Asylum quite a bit. I think when you see a film from like the 70s, a lot of, if you talk to a lot of younger film fans that are exposed to older films, they'll say, the effects. I can't watch something with bad effects.
Right.
But usually the storytelling in something like this is so solid that you can kind of dismiss the poor effects a little bit.
I disagree with you. I know where you're coming from, because Amicus put out the first adaptation of Tales from the Crypt, their take on it. I think Asylum is a much more sophisticated film. I think it's a much better written film. Tales from the Crypt seems very juvenile to me.
I think two of the stories are phenomenal. There's a story with the Santa Claus with Joan Collins, which is very
but
creepy.
It just kind of ends. There's no real...
I think it's a nice payoff, and then I like the story at the end with the blind home, and I also love the story with Peter Cushing, who gives a wonderful performance, and the payoff, it's heartbreaking, and it's wonderful.
Wait, the blind home, is that the one where the guy has a choice between the two?
The two
that's
doors.
That's in
Tales from
that's
Crypt.
not in Tales from Crypt. That's in the second one.
That's the Tales from the Crypt. You're thinking of Vault of Horror. It's not. It's in Tales from the Crypt. It's
Sure.
the last story. Positive.
I just hated the whole how they had the Crypt Keeper. That whole stuff was
Ralph
just
Richardson.
awful.
That's bad because it's been done in Dead of Night and
terrible.
other films.
And I just felt that
Terrible
Asylum
framing.
just was much more sophisticated in its writing. It has the best wraparound.
I like
surprising ending.
I liked
Very
a lot of
Asylum.
the acting in Asylum. I liked Herbert Lom.
I
liked
was disappointed in him.
I liked what's his name, Anthony, the guy from no, the guy from Clockwork Orange. What's his name? Try the wine.
Yes. Oh my God.
It doesn't matter. He's good.
Can't
Come back to it.
Have some more. Isn't that Anthony?
Would you
something?
like some wine? What's his name? What's his fucking name?
You what?
McGee. Patrick
McGee.
Yes. Thank you,
He's
Michael.
also in Tales from the Crypt.
I would say, though, it does have one of the weakest stories in all of Amicus Productions, and that's the one with Charlotte Rampling, where she has the
that
imaginary
one's-
friend. And that's just
that one's
terribly
kinda
done.
terrible,
It's
yeah.
obvious that she's a schizophrenic, and...
What I don't like about the Asylum, I mean, I like the movie quite a bit, but I don't like. I love Herbert Lom, and it looks like they're gonna present his story, but they never really present his story on his own. It's just like a story inside the wraparound.
I don't mind. I think actually I like that. I like that they don't have to turn that into another story. That it kind of connects to the whole wrap.
You know what's great though is like Christopher Lee and like Peter Cushing. Actors like Patrick McGee and Herbert Lom are made to be in horror movies. They're just made
creepy
to
as
be in these. Like, and Patrick McGee just talks with his teeth all the time.
But what's great about Herbert Lom is that he was a lot more versatile than people give him credit for. He was effectively creepy in horror films and crime films too.
And Pink
But
Panther.
he was great in the Pink Panther movies too. He was hilarious.
As Dreyfus.
As Dreyfus. He was very funny.
But he looked just as frustrated in the Pink Panther films as he looks in the horror films. That's what makes him that good for that type, you know.
He's a unique character.
Because the Pink Panther films are just like the horror films.
Yeah.
I get that connection.
All right. Well, let's go on to the next one, Eric. What's
So Asylum, what should we talk about? Let's talk about something that everyone's seen, Creepshow.
Creepshow? That's an interesting film.
No. Let's talk about another horror anthology at that time.
But he was hosting.
And
You're
that-
gonna contradict us?
I don't like
Who's
the
hosting
jumping
this
around.
show?
I like a timeline, folks. I like a timeline.
All right, go
what
ahead.
about
American Style is not a horror film.
What about The House That Dripped Blood?
That's with another Amicus film.
Yes.
I didn't see it.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, Jeff has
It is. It's a little bit more tongue-in-cheek.
It is, and it's silly. It's a very silly film.
As some stories are silly.
Kind
I think
of,
the Christopher Lee one, where he's the kind of the
voodoo
good guy.
guy.
That's
like
not really that silly.
I like
but
that
the
The one with the actor?
the actor who what's
the
his name?
cape.
John Pertwee,
John
who
Pertwee,
played
yeah.
Doctor Who. That's a silly one. It's John Pertwee and Ingrid Pitt.
It's not the silliest
And-
film.
Please don't ruin anything. I haven't seen it.
No,
okay.
I don't like it. I promise.
House That Dripped Blood, I think I think the wraparound's a little silly.
Yeah.
But I think otherwise it's a good time.
That was another Robert Bloch screenplay.
And Delham Elliott is very good in it. He's in one of the stories as well. I will say Amicus is
Well, a lot of these, it should be said, a lot of these were directed by Freddie Francis.
Freddie Francis,
who was an
cinematographer.
extraordinary cinematographer, did a lot of work for
David Lynch.
not just David Lynch, but he did a couple things for Martin Scorsese.
He
as
did
well.
Cape Fear.
Did Cape Fear.
Terrific guy. Terrific.
Love Freddie Francis.
He did Tales from the Crypt. He didn't do the follow-up, the sequel to which was Vault of Horror. That was Roy Ward Baker, who directed quite a few for Amicus as well. I'm a huge Amicus film, but I will say some of their
fan.
really stink.
You're not a huge Amicus film. You're a
How
huge
many
Amicus
people
film
made
fan.
it?
Sorry, I'm tired. I'm a huge Amicus film fan. I love I prefer them to Hammer. I really do. I have a great time. I always. I think their films are just made to be fun and
I don't know about
fun.
that.
I will say they made some stinkers though. One called The Monster Club, which is one of the absolute
Actually,
worst.
let me tell you something. The Monster Club has one of the best single stories in any anthology film I ever saw, and it's the guy visiting the
Whitman.
town of the zombies.
with Stuart Whitman.
Yes,
I will
that
say though,
is fucking
you haven't,
amazing. I love that.
Correct
Love
me on
that.
this, but you haven't seen that in a very long time, right?
Actually, I watched it when you and I first got to know each other.
Okay, that's fairly recent. I'm about to say
Yeah,
if you saw
I
it now, you
enjoyed
may not
that. I
appreciate
enjoyed
it
that
as
quite a
much.
bit. It was like
Framing
WLR
device.
It's
in the
a
afternoon.
stupid, silly framing advice. It's just
Yeah,
stupid.
and one of the stories, the guy, has a stake-proof vest, so he, so he doesn't, get staked. The vampire wears a stake-proof vest. It's one of the dumbest things I've
An
ever.
interesting one is Torture Garden, the one with Burgess Meredith.
Yeah, and actually, that was just got released on DVD. It's actually 8
That's
minutes
actually
longer.
really interesting. The framing device is pretty interesting. It's interesting because it's probably the grimmest of all the anthology ones. It's not silly, and there's a darker tone to it.
Well, gee, with the title "Torture Garden," you
Well, it's I don't want to get into it because I don't want to give too much away. But it's really interesting that the character it's like there is no such thing as an uncorruptible character in this in a way that's sort of different than the other. The other films feel like comic books on film, with maybe the exception of Asylum, where there's a little more sophisticated writing going on there. But with this one, it's really just about just the baseness of human nature and.
Actually, going back to Asylum, I think maybe the strongest story within that was the cobbler and Peter Cushing, or the carpenter and Peter Cushing building the
it was no,
that tailor.
It was like
the
cobbler. What the
yeah,
hell
the
are you talking
tailor
about?
making the suit for Peter
That was
Cushing's
very
son.
interesting, yeah.
That was very good. That actor, I forget what his name is, Barry something, and he was in Space 1999.
Barry Norman?
No.
No.
Hey, Jeff,
Barry something or other.
I'm just curious. Have you guys seen one of my? What was the one I'm trying to remember?
getting off
From
the
Beyond the
subject.
Grave.
From Beyond the Grave's okay.
Never seen it.
That's a very good one. I
haven't
like.
seen-
I like.
But this problem is they ripped off. I should say they ripped off a lot of ideas.
Bring up
from-
more anthologies we haven't seen.
Yeah,
It's awesome TV.
they ripped off a lot of their
Fantastic.
stories from the original anthology horror film that started it all, which is a film called Dead of Night. It came out in the late 40s. It was a British film. It was early 40s. I'm sorry. It was a British film. None of you guys have seen it. I'll try to get you guys to see it before we did this episode. But it's interesting for the precedent it's set. But a lot of the stories, like with the mirror and the room inside the mirror, that was taken from that movie.
I do like the from Beyond the Grave though, because I like the framing device quite a bit. Where the people who steal from the store, that little device they have.
It was all right. It wasn't like the strongest framing device.
You know what's better than all right? Creepshow. I
Yeah, let's talk about
Creepshow.
Thank you. Something I've
Fine.
seen.
So Creepshow, let's get on Creepshow. Creepshow, the George Romero directed, Stephen King scripted. I still have a copy of the graphic novel that came out at the same time. It was Stephen King and George Romero's attempt to pay homage to the EC horror comics of like the 50s, like Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror.
They couldn't get the rights to it, so they made their own.
So
Basically.
they made their own. I personally think it's a really fun movie. I think that it's flawed in certain ways.
The stories are too predictable.
I think I also think there's one too many stories. I think maybe if they kept it to like 4 stories instead of like 5 words.
Well, what story would you remove? Because I love the old man with the roaches.
Oh, I would remove the worst one.
I
Which
think
it's the Ted Danson and.
I kind of like the Ted Danson
See, the problem
one.
I have,
the
the
Ted
problem I
Danson
have with
one.
the Ted Danson one is that
Do you know what's going to happen?
I like the idea behind it. I just think it could have been better executed. I think all the stories have something. I would say my least favorite one is Father's Day, the very first story.
I like that one.
I just
Where's my cake?
you could tell
Yeah,
that
kinda
they
gruesome.
wanted to have the story where you could have the dad coming back from a grave saying, where's my cake? But I don't understand why he killed Ed Harris, because he had nothing to do with whatever vengeance the father wanted to get on the family.
Yeah,
It's
that's
in the
true.
wrong place. at the wrong
Like
time.
little stuff like that kind of just annoy me about the story. I think it gets
it's-
better as it goes on, like the crate.
Yeah,
That's my
was
favorite.
exceptional.
That's the best one. That's what should have ended the movie.
I don't know. I
really
like
do
the old
like-
man with the roaches.
And I
That
like the
was-
Roach one too.
That's
that
a
was
good
a good
one,
coda.
but I think the other one should have been.
But that that was that was a freaky one.
And I do love Adrienne Barbeau. There's that whole Hal Holbrook's imagining her killing her. It's brilliant, really funny too.
And it is scary. It's effectively frightening. I think they have some good scares in there. And I think I love the design, the whole conceit that's a comic book.
It really
and
feels
they
like it.
put
I
in,
like
the
that.
frames and stuff like
And
that.
I really, really liked the Stephen King one.
A lot of people don't like that one. but
I know,
like
I
it.
initially
I
I
am
didn't
one of
like
those.
it, and then
I'm
I like
iffy
it.
on it.
I liked it.
Meteor shit. But Creepshow 2 is probably one of the worst sequels ever made.
It does have a good story. One good story.
One
float.
The float is, that's the only good thing
That's
about
a very, very...
Everything else about it is terrible. Even the framing device is terrible.
And I have to make a quick recommendation. If anyone has a multi-region player out there, please get the 2-disc version of Creepshow. Our friend Mike Felser did a 2-hour documentary on it, which is very fascinating, so check that out.
Well, can I?
Go ahead.
I was
Please,
going to
I'm
say,
sorry.
I was just going to comment about Creepshow 2. It's so crappy that you can only remember that one story. Because I know one involves
hey, ladies, thanks for the ride.
Yeah, but that could be like your Stuck movie. It's almost similar, except different zombie. That's the only difference.
And the other story is The Indian with George Kennedy, which is very...
That's a cigar story. Anyone did.
Yeah, boy, I barely remember that.
I just remember it because George Kennedy was in it.
Terrible.
The float is good, though, but the acting is terrible.
But with Creepshow, I'm sorry to cut you off again. With Creepshow, I enjoyed it. I remember being scared of it as a child when it used to come on television, and Stephen King's story was the one I always remembered, the one he acted in. But as I watch it now, I agree with Eric. It's more fun than anything. It's not really scary to me anymore.
Not. Because that's the thing about those comics is that one episode, 1 week it would be a scary story, then it'd be a silly story. Every story would be different, a different tone and a feel. And that's what they do in the movie. A lot of the stories feel different. One is kind of serious, one is somewhat serious. The Crate is probably the most straightforward story in the movie, I would say, even though it does have its humorous moments, as we discussed earlier. The Crate is definitely the best, I think, of both.
I would say the biggest flaw of the film too is they push the comic book conceit too much. Every time like a scary thing happens, it goes with the blue in the background. So it just telegraphs so much. That's a big problem with the Ted Danson story, I thought. But I like the idea behind it.
I'm surprised you liked that one because you knew immediately what was going to happen. You knew they were going to come back from the dead for a minute.
I did know. I was a fan of the comic books that it was paying homage to. That's why I wanted to see it.
But it's also nice to see Leslie Nielsen in a non-comedic role. Also,
well, actually, he did that before he became known for the whole.
He was Mr. 70s Sideburn
just
guy.
before.
But he had Airplane, didn't he, at the time?
Yeah, but he still wasn't. I mean, he was like not the main. He wasn't.
Okay. Don't forget, he was in Nuts with Barbra Streisand. He played it, beat her up, and I was cheering every minute. He was very terrifying.
That's an obscure.
But I'm saying he still continued to do serious movies. But anyway,
the next anthology film I want to talk about is actually one of my favorite horror films of all time. Mario Bava,
one of my favorite.
A classic cult Italian filmmaker. He's best known for Black Sunday, a famous take on this sort of vampire mythos. He had another horror film, which I think is better. It's called Black Sabbath. It's his take on an anthology horror film. It's only 3 stories. There's no real framing device. It's just Boris Karloff narrating, introducing each story. Now, there are 2 versions of this film, and the more notorious one is the one that was edited, released in the United States, where they changed the sequences to the stories, and they took out
a lesbian
the final. Well, yeah, they took out the lesbian subtext in the first, which was the first story in the Italian version, but got moved to like the middle portion of the film when it was released in America. Also, they took out a controversial final shot, which some people hate it. Some people think it's clever and funny. If you have to see it, you be the judge.
I love it.
But I've always loved this film. I think it's a very atmospheric film. I'm not crazy about the story involving the lesbian lovers, because you know where that's going.
Well, actually, that was one of my favorite ones.
Oh, really? Interesting. Oh, great.
Well, the version I saw it was the first story, and I can honestly say I really enjoyed it because I didn't know too much going into it. I just knew it was an anthology. So watching that story, I was actually quite surprised by the ending because I actually didn't see that coming.
Interesting, because like I grew up as a fan on films where like there's the twist ending where someone's trying to drive someone else insane, which is basically a rip off something that's been done before. That's a twist that's been done over and over.
Oh, well, I guess I didn't see it coming when I
that's
saw
where I was coming from. I was like, oh gee, it was just done in like 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes instead of like a standard.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking they were thinking that. I just thought it was going to be the typical prisoner escaped and was.
Did you like what story did you like least though?
The story I liked the least was actually the second story. I didn't hate it outright.
That's the one I was surprised that I did like the least.
See, I like that one the most.
I like Drop of Water the most.
Or the third one, maybe.
The third one's my favorite, the Drop of Water.
Well, the Drop of Water one was the reason why I put this up there as one of my favorite horror films of all time, because that scared the shit out of me the first time I saw that. And I thought, no. At the time, I grew, got a little older, and I was like, I just thought it was scary because I was a kid, and then I saw it again, and it scared the shit out of me again because there's something about that.
The sound is what scares me.
Well, I don't want to give away what happened. I mean, the premise of the third story involves this woman. She's a caretaker of this what might be a witch, and this woman dies, and she decides to steal this woman's ring. It turns out it's cursed, and she winds up being haunted by a drop of sound of dripping water. And then there's this like sort of payoff to the end of the story, which is what this movie's famous for.
Wait a second.
Yeah,
How
was
could
scary.
we talk about anthology horror films and not mention Twilight Zone the movie?
Well, I want to finish this one.
Well, we're not done with this one yet.
Hello, stop jumping.
I love this movie because, let me tell you, it's beautifully shot.
It is beautifully shot. I want to go back to the
Boris
Karloff one. It's great, too.
The Warlock, it's called. It's not so like Warlock.
No, it's a Vertalock.
Warlock, thank you.
Which is a Russian vampire.
I think it's decent, but it's my least favorite. I like it,
agree.
though, because I think, I mean, it should have been
I think it's
strongest.
interesting because it's very disturbing if you think about it. This is a character that comes back home to his house. And the only reason why he can go into his house and kill off his family one by one is because he's invited to the home. It kind of subverts these like legends. And the first one to go is the kid. You know,
see that in the movie.
and it's just about this, like, it's almost like a Cassavetes film, but pure detail, where it's about the destruction of this family, you know. And this guy who was supposed to protect them went out to protect them because his whole thing was he was going out to kill this vampire that was threatening his family. He comes back as the vampire.
I like it, but it's my least favorite of the stories. I mean, I love Boris Karloff, though. He's very good.
You like it
the least of the three.
You like the lesbian one better?
I like Drop of Water, number one.
lesbian story.
The lesbian sub one is number two, and then the
Interesting.
Warlock was number three. But I liked all the stories. I think the film, this is just, it's very well structured, and the American version really does ruin it. I don't like the sequencing at all.
But you didn't see it in America because I lent you my copy, and that's not the American version.
I got to say, and it's influenced a lot of people. In fact, hey, Black Sabbath got their name from the movie. You know, it's a lot of people have seen it, and it's really touched a chord with people, and it's very scary. I mean, it's amazing how that you know, that sound of water dropping is scary as shit. I don't know why that it's so creepy. I mean, after I saw it, I really was like, oh shit, I got to turn my faucet. You know, I was getting nervous.
I gotta start saving water.
Yeah, anyway, so now we can go
Now we
on
can
Twilight
listen
Zone.
to you.
I saw it in the theater. I saw it in the theater. The kid
Twilight
scared
Zone.
me.
Twilight Zone was most famous.
crap,
I mean, it
but-
got a bit of notoriety because of the tragic, horrific accident that happened during the John Landis film segment. Twilight Zone was a big disappointment in a sense that I could say there's only one really. I would say there's two good stories in it. The best one is definitely George Miller's for me. The very last one.
I think more than Joe Dante's.
I like him so much. I think it's so much better. Joe Dante's is a lot of fun.
I like Joe Dante's.
I think
That's my
But I
favorite
think George Miller's is a mini masterpiece
because
it's scary.
Terror from like 12,000 feet up
Yeah,
or whatever.
and it's
See, that was my least favorite.
God. I
Really?
see
That was my least
really.
favorite.
Wait,
You like
you like it better than the Vic Morrow one?
Kick the can.
You like it better than Spielberg?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, I was
You know, that one is so forgettable that I forgot it was even in that
So
movie.
you liked it better than Spielberg's, and you liked it better than John Landis's, which was incomplete.
John Landis is so
I
heavy-handed.
like John Landis's one actually.
It's really, but you know what? In
So
order to make the
heavy-handed.
shortcuts without him, since he died, because they changed the ending. The original ending was
He was supposed to save the kids and
well,
die.
save the kids from the
but
helicopter.
it just ends.
He ends in a car. And
Well, yeah, he's
not-
going off to the concentration camp.
But it's just
I liked it. You may think it was heavy-handed, but I liked it.
I thought it was too
But
heavy-handed.
Joe Dante's was my favorite, though, of the one. I like the.
Don't get me wrong, I like Joe Dante's. I think it's very imaginative, but I think the George Miller one is just.
I think it's ironic that the two
Exceptionally
biggest
well done.
directors have the two worst, you know, in the movie.
Well, I think the whole thing is that George Miller's is more subtle, whereas Joe Dante's is
Warner
a
Brothers
little
cartoon.
bit, you know, exactly. I mean, I like them both. I couldn't, but if I had to pick one, I like more maybe the showmanship because I was young when I saw it, so I like the Joe Dante one. But I can appreciate also the George Miller one, and I like the John Landis one, but like how it's directed, it just feels incomplete.
What I like about the Joe Dante one is that each one of the directors did a pretty straightforward remake of an original, well, except with the exception of John Landis, of course, a pretty straightforward remake of the original Twilight Zone episodes.
Right.
You know, even though the George Miller one you might like, it's very much like the original with William Shatner. There's not
very,
much to-
very, very similar.
Joe Dante
with a
just
better actor.
takes the very, I agree with you on that, takes the very basic
Easy now on
elements
Shatner.
of the other one and really goes in a completely different direction and does something really unique. And
But he
original with it.
changes the ending, and he also changes the ending of the source story that the original Twilight Zone episode was. It was much darker. The kid wins.
Yeah, I wish
In
they
the
would have done.
original
I
one.
wish they would have done that, but I still
Whereas
liked
this
it.
one, the kid becomes good, and she's going to take care of him. And-
Well, supposedly. I mean, who knows?
But
She
come
could
on,
raise him into
yeah,
evil
but do you
super
think that's
for-
the message at the end of that story?
She's a very evil woman. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, who cares? I mean, I just
Kathleen Quinlan, she was hot at the time.
she was.
Mm.
And it's well acted. It really is, and it's great to see all the the familiar actors. And I love the families. So like when they go into the house and she sees that the kid has kidnapped all these families, and they're just like, "Get me out of here!" It's really creepy.
Yeah, the what's her name? The fake Tina Yothers is the future voice of Bart Simpson.
Oh yes, Nancy Cartwright.
Nancy Cartwright.
Who's
That's
actually
right,
calling,
Nancy Cartwright's
who's actually
That's so
calling
funny.
as Bart Simpson for Scientology meetings. Actually,
And Kevin McCarthy.
That's
Kevin
right.
McCarthy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right. There's that scene where she
Do we know who Kevin McCarthy is out there, film fans?
I hope so.
Well, this is not a live show, so nobody's calling
We only have a
in.
couple more, we only have a couple more minutes left.
He was
I can
the
see.
original lead of Invasion of the Body
Body
Snatchers, and he's been on a couple of
One of
Joe
my
Donnie
favorites.
stuff. He was in Inner Space, and
Yeah, but any other ones you'd
Mike
like to
Hoover.
recommend since we have?
Mike Hoover.
But there wasn't much of a wraparound though with Twilight Zone though.
No,
there was
wraparound.
sort of, it was that whole bit with it started
Dan
off with something
Aykroyd.
with
Yeah,
Albert
yeah.
Brooks, and actually that's a fairly
That's pretty
well done
creepy.
scene. Yeah.
Yeah.
Want to see something really scary? And that actually creeped the shit out of me as a kid. I saw it in the theater. I was like, and I wanted to see War Games. I didn't want to see Twilight Zone the movie. My mother took me to see Twilight Zone the movie.
Why?
No, 'cause
Somehow War
You
Games
grew up
creeped
to
you
like
out
She was
more.
like,
exploitation
we're not
flick
going to
ever
go
made.
see War Games. You're going to like Twilight Zone.
because she already saw War Games, so I had to go see it. I saw it in Times Square, so that was pretty creepy.
Can we think of any other anthology films?
I can recommend, let's see. Well, I do recommend Volta Horror and Tales from the Crypt. Those are very good pieces to see together.
Did anyone see this film from the 80s? I was talking about it briefly. It's called Nightmares.
Yes, there's a TV film.
I only know
Actually,
wasn't a
Emilio
TV film. It was
Estevez.
made in theaters.
and it was made for TV, but then it was released in theater.
Right,
Yes,
and it was Emilio Estevez as a guy gets sucked into the video game.
Yeah,
Trust me, you're
Battle,
not
General
ruining
Battle.
anything.
Oh, and then
I like John
Awful.
Carpenter's Body Bags. I mean, it's not awesome, but I liked it.
I like the one story with Stacy Keach. That was a great one. I didn't care for the.
I like what was it?
Gas station?
The carotene one.
Yeah, Sam Raimi has a great cameo as a dead body out of a locker.
Yeah, I didn't mind that one.
The only one I remember is the Stacy Keach story.
I didn't.
actually.
Well, then there was the
Toby Hooper did the third one. Which was
yeah,
terrible.
what was that? Mark Hamill.
Isn't that
Yeah,
always?
the eye transplant.
Yeah, I didn't mind that one either. I mean, it was.
Nah, it's too predictable. I'm trying to think, is there any other good anthology? Oh, we're out of time.
We don't have to think of anything now,
No.
except
No,
how
because
fast
it's-
to get home.
Well,
It's so fucking
avoid
late.
avoid Tales That Witness
So
Madness.
here's a question.
Avoid nightmares.
What story do you think you are in Asylum? If you were a story in Asylum, which story would
He'd
you
be the Herbert Lom story, definitely.
Definitely the tailor, because I just love clothes.
No, I think he'd be the person that gets chopped up by that one. All right, until next week. Thank you. Check out the website.
I'd probably be the schizophrenic.
I'd be the doctor, but I'd fight back more.
That was
Fight.
film from the Amicus group was a film called Asylum. And it's an interesting film. It's written by Robert Bloch. It's not the first time he's written a film for Amicus, but I think this is one of his better written films. It's still kind of dated. It still has that 70s feel to it. The effects are kind of cheap, but I think it's got one of the more clever wraparound plot devices.
Definitely the best framing device.
Definitely the best framing device. I mean, the conceit of the film is a psychiatrist is brought to an asylum. He's being interviewed to possibly head up this new asylum. The catch is that the previous head went insane, and his test is to interview 4 different patients and try to guess which one was this former head. And so each patient's interview becomes this little, each person's story. I loved this film when I was a kid. Looking back on it, I still think it's a lot of fun. I still think it's the best of all the other anthology films that they put out. It doesn't feel as cheesy.
It's entertaining.
It's an independent film production company that was set up to sort of compete against Hammer films.
Light.
But they were actually 2 Americans that actually went to England, and do you know what amicus means?
It
means friends in Latin.
It does.
Oh,
there you go.
I have nothing to
I'm a
add to
huge
that.
amicus.
Now, the biggest difference between Amicus and Hammer was big on the period. Usually, they did the Dracula.
Very
Frankenstein,
stylized.
Very stylized. They didn't start off as a horror film unit. They actually started off doing comedies and stuff like that, and then segued into sci-fi.
Because I think
crime
Hammer
thrillers.
was originally trying to compete with Ealing Studios.
It's Ealing.
Ealing,
Even
okay.
I know
Yeah,
that
it's
one.
Ealing Studios.
Oh my God.
But then they hit pay dirt by remaking the Universal horror stuff like Dracula, Frankenstein, stuff like that, but doing it unofficially. Anyways, Amicus decided to compete against these guys. Their biggest difference is most of their films were anthology films, so they did 1 or 2 standalone films, and most of them weren't period films. They were present day. So that's a big difference between Amicus and whatever. I think for me, my favorite horror
Hi, I'm Edwin Samuelson, and welcome to the Cinefiles, a show that allows you to eavesdrop on the conversation of fellow film fanatics. Today we'll be discussing horror anthologies, and I'm going to hand over the mic and the hosting duties tonight of the show to my left over here to Mr. Eric Cohen, who will introduce the rest of our panel. Go ahead,
You're going to
Eric.
hand over your mic. That means you're going to be silent for this one?
Go ahead, Eric.
We wanted to do this show for Halloween, but we never
agree with you.
It suffers from some of the cheesy effects. Like, for instance, the first story, if the effects were better, that could have been a chilling thing. But the effects were just kind of hokey.
I guess if we're talking about anthology films, we should say we try to give a little detail on what each story is about. You have the story with the
this were an hour show, why not?
And it's very Tales from the Crypt-esque.
Yes,
basically.
but I found this one better than the original Tales from the Crypt movie, or at least I enjoyed it more.
That's my favorite of all the anthology films would be Tales from the Crypt, I would believe, of the amicus.
I liked Asylum quite a bit. I think when you see a film from like the 70s, a lot of, if you talk to a lot of younger film fans that are exposed to older films, they'll say, the effects. I can't watch something with bad effects.
Right.
But usually the storytelling in something like this is so solid that you can kind of dismiss the poor effects a little bit.
I disagree with you, and I know where you're coming from, because Amicus put out the first adaptation of Tales from the Crypt, their take on it. I think Asylum is a much more sophisticated. Had the opportunity to tape a Halloween show, and the closest opportunity we had to doing a Halloween show, I was out of town. You guys wound up doing something else. I have no idea what it was.
Hookers. Shows on Hookers.
Good.
We actually did
wish I was
Hookers.
here for that one. But yeah, we're going to do anthology horror film. It's a very special corner, subgenre of a popular genre, and I guess the best choice.
Wait, what is it the subgenre of?
The subgenre of horror. The sub being anthology.
That was co-host Mike Foltz, by the way.
This is Jeff Galashaw.
Jeff
That would be
Galashaw.
Jeff
I,
Galashaw.
I had to introduce them
I told
too.
you.
Dude,
Yeah,
he
I-
keeps burdening me with all this crap.
Okay, I'll do it.
He wants to
Jeff
give me money.
Galashaw, Michael Foltz, Eric Cohen.
It's
wanna
very
give me your
easy to tell us
microphone.
apart. You'll have to guess how.
So, anyways, yeah, anthology horror films. You know what we mean by horror films with like little short stories with them to comprise one big film.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you for
thank
your
you.
sarcasm. Anyway, so I guess a good way to start off with an Amicus film, because Amicus was sort of the production company that kind of made it popular. They were this British